Hi everybody, welcome to the second round of seminars now. Still going to type a few videos for the last ones. This one is about assignment writing. And hoping that I can help you and the other students can help you not make the same mistakes I did, where I had lots of knowledge and information, but I didn't know where to begin to put it down on paper. So what this is what this seminar is about. Take your ideas, put it into something cohesive, because sure, as you've probably noticed, that knowing everything doesn't get you the best marks. It's your ability to convey that in a logical and concise manner using quality sources. Using the correct sources and referencing, which we'll go through in week 3, can be up to 15% of your mark. So 1/6, the 1/6.7th of your mark is sources and referencing them correctly. And knowing what sources are legitimate and what aren't is a real skill. But there are some tricks, and that's what we're going to go through. How to spot good sources, how to spot bad sources, where to find them. So, actually, in the chat, give me some ideas. Even write down in your paper what you think are good sources. What makes a good source of information? And where may you find them? Yeah, so Ewan says reliable and accurate. Izzy says Google Scholar. Anybody else? Have a think. A minute or two to have a think. Jot down some notes. So I'll put one in there. There you go, I put one in there. Not Wikipedia. So how official the source is. So who is saying this stuff? Is it some guy on Facebook who watched a YouTube video and now is an expert? Or is it a doctor? So Lachlan said scientific journals, and he said World Health Organization. So I think you guys are... Oh, Kelly's entered the waiting room. So I'll put her on the spot here and make her. Kelly, can you put in the chat what makes a good source of information? Quickly. Putting you on the spot. So I think Ewan's dad is a anesthesiologist, not an anaesthetist. So if I was looking up how to put someone to sleep with surgery, I probably wouldn't trust me, but I would definitely trust Ewan and Anna's dad, because he is a certified professional. He has an education. Yeah, so Kelly says it has to be reliable. So you guys are well ahead of most adults. Most adults have no idea what a good source is. If someone says something in the right way that they understand, it's immediately a good source. There's some conspiracy theory on YouTube, on Facebook, the Daily Mail, the Sun, newspapers are not good sources. So I'll put the chat away. Okay, so just want to make it clear that Wikipedia is never an acceptable source to use. Anyone want to try and argue differently in the chat? I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. Usually the first thing you'll see on an assignment and referencing is do not use Wikipedia. But I want to show you something. So, no, anyone else think? So Ewan says Wikipedia can sometimes be reliable. Okay. Depending on the author. But what we don't know is who wrote the information, all their credentials, off the top of our heads. So we go over to, let me share my. What should I search for? Wikipedia. Will give me an idea. What am I searching for? I'll use something topical as always. I'm just going to get the news, aren't I? Okay, that didn't work out the way I wanted. Wikipedia. I do have a cold at the moment. Not that kind of cold. Big cold. So, coronavirus. So, what I can't do, what you shouldn't do, I mean, sometimes you can, but for school work, you can't trust the reliability of what's been written because it can be edited. And whilst the editing is moderated, for your school assignments, you are not allowed to reference Wikipedia. Same with university. If you do it, you will lose marks. But let's say I want to use something that's been said on Wikipedia. Sometimes it has really good information. Get rid of this. Oh, why is that doing it now? There we go. So let's say, okay, I want to find out, I like this piece of information. It agrees with what I've said and it makes sense. What you shouldn't do is reference Wikipedia. What you should do is click on the reference here and it'll take you down to the reference list for Wikipedia. So you can then use this reference in your reference list by using the same information. So whilst you should never directly reference Wikipedia, you can use the references that that person has supplied, provided it's a legitimate source. And we're going to go through what is a legitimate source and what isn't. So before I get too carried away with ranting about Wikipedia, so which of these two is more credible? I want to know, I heard on the radio that 5G causes coronavirus. And I want to go online. And I found these two sources of information. One says that coronavirus is spread by 5G. The other argues against. So this is proof that 5G is going to make us all sick. Or this one. So this is a journal article published in a journal with all of the author's details available. Which one, even just in life, not even in your assignments, in the chat, which one is more reliable? Okay. You guys are much smarter than most adults. The second one is definitely the correct one. We have this one. We have no idea who made this video. We have no idea what their intentions are. No idea if there's a financial incentive for them to do it. They're not linked to any kind of ethics or standards in publishing. They can basically say whatever they want. This one, definitely not the case. They can only publish what is reasonably true, or can be reasonably proven to be true. They have to declare any financial or any other kind of conflicts of interest. So if they also owned, I don't know, some kind of device that I don't even know how to put it into context because it's ridiculous. But if they had a financial conflict of interest, they would have to declare it. These are, and we'll talk about this at the end with peer review, but these are read and edited and analyzed by a group of their peers, so other people in the field. You can even see these guys in a very professional journal have said, it sounds rather bizarre. And that is putting it bluntly. So, is there anything else that's important to note when looking at a source? In the chat. If it was published 50 years ago, do you think it's relevant today? Or do you think there's more relevant research? Okay, so it's no's all round. I don't know if anyone can see that's watching. The recording can see the chat. Izzy says probably not, which is also correct. That's in my thesis, I used a reference from the 1960s because nothing else had been done in the field. But for the most part, when a field is rapidly moving, 5 years, within 5 years. For fields that are not so rapidly moving or general information, it's 10 years. It will usually clearly state in your assignment, in your task sheets, what the expectations of the sources are. So I'm going to use the following framework that you can use to go through to find out which is the better source, or how to analyze any kind of source. So, unless you're the expert in your field, doing the research and writing about it, then you need a source for the information you're saying. You can't just, unless you're the expert in the field, sorry, then you can't come up with statements off the cuff. You don't have that knowledge. That knowledge has to come from somewhere else. So that's why we have sources. If I was to go and talk about, using Anna and Owen's data as an example, anesthesia, I would have to go and get references for it. I'm an expert where I'm talking about chemistry and organic chemistry and pharmacology. I don't need to source what I'm saying because I know it to be true. I have the experience and the education to say that. But in high school, you do not. And there's a big, big jump between 8, 9, and then from 10 upwards. And it's mostly based around the sources and the information that you get. And a lot of people, again, have lots of knowledge, they know lots of stuff, but they struggle around this, finding the correct sources. So, do all sources have the same academic rigor? Meaning, are they all the same? So, if you were to rank them, YouTube and then journal articles, they don't have the same, do they? They are on different levels. And there's this hierarchy of information. So at the top, I probably should have put a slide on this, but I was going to talk about it in my head because that's what I do. At the top, you have what we call meta-analysis. And that is an analysis of the entire field. Or it may be an analysis, let's say, one of the ones I use as an example is the conspiracy theory of vaccines causing autism. And There's been like every study that's ever been conducted has been analyzed by this meta-analysis at the very top of the pyramid. And it says that every piece of data does not conclude the fact that vaccines cause autism. There's no link there. Underneath that is the large-scale studies or in real-time studies, so they're following people. Below that is where they look backwards. And then underneath that is websites, all other pieces of academic writing. So at the top we have the meta-analysis of the entire field. In the middle, so if we're talking about vaccines cause autism, sorry, I've got a sore throat now. Then we have, underneath that, we have the studies that are in real time, so they're actively looking at the cases and actively looking at kids that get vaccines and watching them, like day to day or year to year. Underneath that, we have studies that look back, so retrospective or retroactive studies. So they look back at medical records, but they're not quite as rigorous as the other two. And then underneath that is everything else. And then there's varying levels under that with websites and newspapers, Wikipedia at the very bottom, government websites near the top there, .org. You know, there is a ranking system within the website. So websites aren't completely useless with referencing. So I want you guys to find 3 references to either support 5G is spreading COVID-19 and vaccines cause autism. And find a variety. So one might be a YouTube video, one might be a news article, one might be a journal. You have 5 minutes to find those and let me know when you've found them. I don't need to know what they are. We're going to use this framework to determine if the references that you've chosen or the sources that you've chosen, sorry, references and sources are an interchangeable term. And then we're going to use the framework for you to determine if the references that you found for these two things are up to standard. And then hopefully you can then apply that So Ewan's found an article, health.gov.au. I don't need to see the references, just to be clear. You just need to keep them and find them. We use the one that Ewan just put in the chat there as an example of a good source of information. So 3 more minutes to find it. If you're watching the recording, just skip ahead. So don't worry about putting them in the chat, just find them and we will go through them. We will go through I'll go through this framework that I have for looking at sources. And you guys can decide if all the references for and against, don't just pick one side. Part of finding the right information is looking at all sides of that. One more minute. We'll go 2 more minutes. Be nice. Okay, everybody got their references? Just trying to find one more. It's very difficult to find sources that agree with this because a lot of them have been blocked by Google. So I think Olivier has just joined. If I can find the talking head around. What we've done so far is we found, if I can get this to go away. Is we found 3 references or 3 websites to support one of these claims or both of these claims. And then we're going to use this framework that I have to, what's the word? Analyze the sources of information. So if you want to quickly find 1 minute to find a couple of sources for these, and then I'm just going to stop the video so that I can't see you on the recording. 1 minute, quickly find those. So put in the chat quickly, where did your sources come from? Into the websites, YouTube videos. So let's analyze the sources that we found. This is going to be you guys analyzing them yourselves whilst I'm explaining what I mean. And there's 6 ideas in this framework. I think there's 6. So 7. So we need to have valid and reliable information. It needs to be relevant and directly related to the question that we're answering. It needs to be current and up to date. It needs to be accurate. We need to have a variety of sources. And I'll explain all of these steps. one we're looking at when we're going through. So primary and secondary sources. Primary is the person doing, say in this case, doing the research. Secondary is the person writing about it. And we need to sometimes use a variety of sources, and that's okay. But they have to be the right kind of sources. But looking at the chat, I can see that you guys are pretty smart, pretty clued up when it comes where to find the correct information. So valid and reliable. Any ideas what that might mean? Just put them in the chat so we don't have people talking over each other. So reliable and valid does it agree with the established science in this case? Yeah, so as it stands now, it needs to be valid, reliable. When you see, people that sort of lick their lips when they see a study come out that goes against the science, it goes against 100 years of science, it goes against 100 years of psychology, 100 years of health. Because usually it's not valid. They haven't used the best methods. What sometimes happens is instead of, I'll use science as an example because I guess that's my area. But it conveys across all of when you're looking for sources. Is that sometimes people come up with a question and they come up with the methods to answer that question. Then you get people or groups, they have an answer and they design a study to get that answer that they want. So they will actively not do things that will go against the answer that they want. Now that's not valid, is it? It's not reliable. If you are actively excluding things that will go against the answer that you want in a scientific study, or if you're not trying to answer a question, but you're trying to make an answer happen, do you think that is what you want? Or are you looking for someone or looking for a study that came up with a question and then used the most up-to-date, as Lachlan just said, the most up-to-date, the most confirmed methods to come to their answer to the question? And people can use statistics. I'm sure you guys have studied a bit of maths, know that statistics is really complicated, and you can use little tricks and tips. Now, this is mostly for scientific studies, but it can be for psychology, it can be for any of your other sources. So, this is when you're looking at a scientific item. So it needs to be valid and reliable. If it goes against what everyone else says, they are either the new Einstein or it will get rejected. So, if any of you found any journal articles? So, we need to look at the sources that we found and look at if they are valid and reliable. So if we look at 5G versus coronavirus, I don't know if there's I don't think there's been any studies on it. I really hope there hasn't been, because that would simply confirm. But if we look at, in the 1990s, a guy called Dr. Andrew Wakefield, and he took a very small sample size of kids, I think 8 of them. 6 of them, I think it was 6, had autism and had vaccines. So he went, well, clearly that means, and I'm going to use this example all the way through. Clearly that means that all kids that get vaccines will get autism. Now, do you think that just looking purely at the numbers, when you're only looking at 8 cases, do you think that's enough people to make a valid scientific assumption or any kind of assumption? So glad you all said no. Thank you. Restored my faith in humanity. So we need to have a big enough sample size, because what we look at is a cross-section of the population. Do you ever see those? Oh my gosh, completely lost my brain. When you see like an election, and when you have a political election, and they say, oh, well, the polling says this, and then it's completely different. And that is why it's important to get a cross-section of the population. So that's when this statistical analysis makes sense. When you statistically analyze 8 kids with autism, it says, well, clearly, they're all going to get autism if they get vaccinated. Whereas if you put every child that's ever been studied into that meta-analysis at the top, then the numbers start to disagree, because it's such a big scale, it completely disagrees. So that's what valid and reliable information is. And this is really, really important. Does the information relate to what you're writing about? If I've asked you, so look at your sources, I've asked you about 5G and coronavirus and vaccines and autism. Do all of your sources relate to those questions? If you had those same questions, and then you found and you got information that talking about, I don't know, Ebola and 5G, or even Ebola, just Ebola in general, is it related to what you're talking about? Does it have any relevance? So it needs to relate to what you're writing about. The biggest mistake is people write their assignments and then just go pick random references and they stick them in. And it's very, very obvious when that happens. Unfortunately, you can tell straight away. So when you're referencing something, make sure it relates to what you're talking about. Don't make it's vaguely on the same topic and it agrees with what I want it to say. No, it has to be relevant. It has to be relevant to what you're writing about. So if you're writing about, I don't know, how fast can someone run in 100 meters in a straight line? And your reference is talking about information taken from a study that looked at how quickly can someone ride 55 kilometers on a bike. There's no relevance there. Even if it kind of says what you want it to do, don't use it. Make sure there's relevance. It's relevant to what you're talking about. So again, have a look at your sources and make sure all of them relate exactly to the question that is being asked. Does 5G cause coronavirus? Or spread, or whatever other crazy things I talk about? Or do vaccines cause autism? If it's not talking about that exact question, then do not include it. So analyze your sources, 30 seconds to do that. Okay. The big one. People find a source that agrees with what they say, but it's 50 years old. And sometimes that's okay. In anything where you're learning about a school, it will not be okay. So why do you think that in any kind of research that you're doing for an assignment, having current and up-to-date information is important. In the chat. So why would it be important for your information to be current and up to date? Do you think, again, if we're looking at this topic, do you think that if we're looking at techniques, scientific, Lockwood says science changes, very good. Techniques change. Kelly said, I was just about to say statistical analysis changes. Information changes, so new ideas come about. And that's why it's so important to have the most up-to-date information. If something's from 20 years ago and there's been 50,000 things written, then you're missing 50,000 pieces of information between that and the most up-to-date information. So Izzy says criteria sometimes changes, especially in the medical field, especially important for when we're talking about vaccines and autism. Vaccines have changed. The diagnostic criteria for autism seems to change with each of the updates to the manual for diagnosing. So Anna said the field of information has changed, so the way that we pick information out of. So when you're looking at data, data is just numbers. It doesn't mean anything. But what we do is we pull information out. Anna said the way that we actually extract information from the data has changed and continually changes. Ideas change, ethics change. 50 years ago, we could do whatever we wanted to lab animals. There was little ethics around that. Biosecurity. So Anna said information, yep. So the information is constantly changing. The stuff that I was learning and the techniques we were pioneering 7 years ago in the lab, this was cutting edge stuff, is now being taught in grade 11 and 12. It's madness. Everything is moving at such a speed now that even 5 years old is too old a lot of the time, depending on the field. So Anna's, sorry, I can't remember the name. So 300 years old, 300 years ago, we thought the earth was flat. Now, some people still think the world is flat. But we now have better methods to understand, collect, store, and interpret data. So we have to make sure that what we're looking at is the most up to date. Thank you for that. That was a really good explanation. So accurate and precise. And it's hard for you guys to know this. So Anna said, 7% of American adults think that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. Why doesn't that surprise you? That's why this is so important, and it wasn't taught, unfortunately, up until maybe 20 years ago, when it was critical thinking became a staple, and the ability to analyze sources and go, actually, that sounds kind of dumb. I don't think I'm going to believe that. So, is the information in the sources accurate? Now, this is usually the job of peer reviewers. So they will then look at the information and confirm. But if you're looking at a source and it is one source amongst everything that you've read that disagrees or confirms something, is there a reason for that? Is the author? Are they anybody? Are they a scientist? Are they a doctor? Are they academic? Are they? I get really passionate and wound up about this because I think this skill is such an important one because it stops you from believing things that are, with all due respect to some people, outrageous. And anyone with a logical brain should be able to think logically. But unfortunately, we are not taught what is a good source. A Facebook meme is not a good source. But that's where a lot of people get their information from. So all I hope you take away from this is that not all sources are the same. And a Facebook meme that disagrees with 100 years of medical science doesn't mean that that Facebook meme is right. And Anna said, don't use Wikipedia. Thank you. Yes. So, is it accurate? Does it agree with everything? If it doesn't, there's usually a reason for that. Yeah. Or Trump's Twitter account. Not the best place to get your medical science from. So, important. On that topic, a variety of sources is paramount. You should never get all of your sources from the same place because it opens yourself up to bias. And we have this thing called bias inside of it. And there's this thing called confirmation bias, where we will only look for things that confirm what we want to believe. So this is big in conspiracy theory people, where they won't, anything that's not written on YouTube or Facebook or written by a scientist or medical doctor is rubbish. They just won't read it because it disagrees with their bias. But on the same token, if all you read is science and journals, you're also kind of opening yourself up to bias. You need to have a collective viewpoint of a topic. When you're writing an essay, you should never just write for one side. You should always have a balanced argument, but one side will always have more than the other side. So you can argue for or against, but you still have to balance the argument. And you can't balance the argument only reading one kind of source. If you get all of your news from Breitbart, which is like a kind of right-wing news organization in the US, and Trump's Twitter account, then you're going to get biased against anyone and everyone. If all you read is The Guardian and other sort of more, they call them left-leaning newspapers, then you're going to have bias towards that side. You know, to say that you should only read one news or whatever from one source, I think is wrong. I think you should have a balanced viewpoint, and then you should have the intelligence to be able to make an informed decision based on your own brain power and the validity of the information that you're reading. And that is a skill that a lot of adults, unfortunately, do not have. Some very intelligent people that I know have fallen victim to the conspiracy theory stuff. These are intelligent people that went to university, that work high-paying jobs, but they only read things that confirm their bias, and they keep confirming that bias, and you can't get away from it. So variety is paramount. So don't just use journal articles, don't just use .gov.au, don't just use textbooks. So have a variety of sources, because it gives you a balanced view of things. So this is the big one. Sorry, I'm dying. Do they have the credentials to match what they're saying? Why? So someone mentioned earlier that they should have, let's put this back on my screen, that you should only use references where you can cite the author. What looks really terrible on your assignment when you're referencing, and we'll get into that in a couple of weeks, is when you see author unknown. If you can't find the author, don't cite it, don't reference it, because you have no idea who wrote that. Anyone on the internet can write whatever they want. Newspapers. Journalists don't have scientific training. Journalists, I will withhold my further opinion. Journalists don't have scientific opinion, and there's journalistic ethics, but at the end of the day, they're there to sell newspapers and bring traffic to their website. So they will over or underreport certain aspects of the story to make it seem more exciting. They will say things that they have no place saying, making claims they can't back up. Whereas someone in a scientific journal or any kind of journal, any kind of respected publication has ethical, moral, and academic standards to adhere to. If you can't identify the author, there's usually a reason for it. If someone writes something and they want to say, look how smart I am, I know all this stuff, listen to me, they will put their name and their credentials to it. If they don't, you probably shouldn't be reading. Well, you might read it, but you definitely shouldn't use it in your argument you're trying to create. So I'll use this as an example, coming close to the end now. I'll share. We have .gov.au, so acceptable, not primary information, but it's still pretty good. Okay, Australian Government Chief Medical Officer. Do you think you get to be the Australian Government Chief Medical Officer without knowing some stuff? I think so. You have the date it was published, 16th of May 2020. It is accepted science. It agrees with what is being said at the top level, which is the meta-analyses and the journal articles and the research that's being done. It also links to another government agency to find out more information. And it's then got a contact. So it's relevant, it's up to date, it's credible, it's from a government website. What else have we said? Can't even remember. It's relevant. It says, answers the question exactly. Does 5G cause coronavirus? No. It's basically what it said. So, that is how we assess our sources. I think I'm still on. I can never tell which screen I'm actually sharing. So, a little bit of overview on the sources. So primary sources are directly from the study. They are from the person who produced the data. At the end of the day, you can say what you want, but when someone analyzes the data and it doesn't agree with what you actually said in the article, you're in big trouble. So how many of your sources that you found were primary sources? So straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. I'll actually explain that. So secondary sources are usually the sources that explain what this information means. So government websites. So this government website is taking all the information from the primary sources and putting it into a secondary resource. Now, when you're reading about something new, should you just go straight to a journal article filled with scientific jargon? Or should you find something a bit simpler? Now, I said never ever reference Wikipedia. But you can read about it on Wikipedia. And then you use the reference. So you find a simpler source, usually a website, and then you then you start reading the primary sources. So I've spoken about peer review first a few times. Whenever you're trying to publish something, it doesn't matter what kind of field it is, if it's in a journal, it undergoes a peer review process. So this poor PhD student, who's probably cried themselves asleep for the last week, submits their manuscript to the journal. It's checked for English, spelling, grammar, but it's then sent to an expert panel of reviewers. So they go through and they will look at what the information or the data that you gathered, does it make sense? Does it match what you're saying? Does it look like it's been doctored or changed anyway? And they will make sure that what you've written actually matches. If not, they'll send it back. This process can take up to a year, because they will just send it back and forth. You change one thing, they'll find another thing, and it goes back and forth. It's the most painful process in the world. So they will tell the journal editor, yes, this is legit, but they need to change this, or they need to do this study again. The editor then sends it back, it goes back and forth, and then eventually the editor will put it in the journal. And that is why the sort of journal articles are considered in such high regard in any field, because it is judged by a panel of your peers. So I will show you, coming up now, time flies when I'm ranting about the sources. So where do I find the best sources? Google Scholar. Everyone use Google Scholar before? So we all know Google Scholar. Spent way too much time on Google Scholar. So we can adjust it. So, okay, I only want to see from 2016. And this is, your school will have like a library where you can access all of this, but you should be able to access everything through the Google Scholar. So if we were wanting to find information to cite, this would be it. This is where we find our primary information. Okay. I thought that was going to be much more low-key than it was, but I think I got a bit excited when I was ranting about the right and wrong sources and people not knowing how to disseminate good information from bad. And if that's what I've taught you, then I'm happy. So I will see everybody next week. Any questions? Stop the recording.